Black uniforms with silver skulls, lightning bolts on collars, death's head insignia that made entire villages empty when spotted on the horizon. The SS believed they were untouchable, the master race enforcing the final solution across occupied Europe. But what happened when the tables turned? When these same men found themselves staring down the barrels of Soviet rifles, their hands raised in surrender. The Red Army didn't read Geneva Conventions to SS prisoners. They remembered Babi Yar. They remembered the burned villages. They remembered the mass graves. Between 1943 and 1945, as Soviet forces pushed west through Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, they captured thousands of SS personnel, officers, guards, Einsatzgruppen killers, concentration camp staff. The fate that awaited them wasn't pretty. Soviet records, German testimonies, and mass grave sites tell a story of systematic revenge that matched the brutality these men had unleashed on Soviet soil. If you value documented World War II history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Soviet military archives and German federal archives. Now back to the story. July 19th, 1943. Near Prokhorovka, after the largest tank battle in history, Soviet forces overran German positions and captured 237 prisoners. Among them, 14 SS Totenkopf officers and 38 enlisted men from the Death's Head Division. The standard Wehrmacht prisoners were processed normally, sent to camps, given water. The SS men were separated immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Sidorov of the 4th Guards Tank Army wrote in his field report that the SS prisoners were stripped of their uniforms and boots. They were marched barefoot through the same villages their units had burned 3 days earlier. Villagers lined the roads. Some threw stones, others just stared. One woman spat directly into the face of SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, the man who had personally ordered her husband's execution. Weber's body was found in a ditch 2 kilometers outside Prokhorovka. Bullet hole behind the left ear. No trial record exists. The pattern was clear from the start. Regular German soldiers might survive Soviet captivity. SS men rarely did. Soviet Order number 270, issued August 4th, 1943, Savagery, specifically stated that members of SS formations were to be treated as war criminals, not prisoners of war. This wasn't random vengeance, it was policy. Captain Dmitry Volkov of the NKVD documented the interrogation of SS Hauptsturmführer Heinrich Miller, captured during the retreat from Kharkov. Miller had commanded an Einsatzkommando unit responsible for killing 8,000 civilians in occupied Ukraine. The interrogation lasted 6 days. Volkov's report lists the methods used: sleep deprivation, cold water immersion, beatings with rifle butts, and what Soviet records euphemistically called enhanced questioning techniques. On day 4, Miller confessed to personally executing 234 Jewish children in Berdichev. On day 5, he provided names of collaborators and locations of mass graves. On day 6, he was taken to a basement room in the NKVD facility and shot. His body was thrown into a pit with 43 other SS corpses. The pit was discovered by construction workers in 1991. Exactly 48 years later, cold, systematic, final. December 15th, 1943. The Soviets captured Korostin, and with it the entire staff of SS training facility Troniki, 112 SS personnel, including the Commandant SS Oberfuhrer Karl Streibel. These weren't frontline soldiers. They were the trainers, the architects of genocide, the men who had taught Ukrainian and Baltic auxiliaries how to efficiently murder Jewish civilians. The captured SS men were loaded onto cattle cars, the same type of cars they had used to transport victims to extermination camps. The irony wasn't lost on their Soviet captors. Senior Lieutenant Boris Petrov recorded that several SS officers begged for quick executions rather than deportation to Soviet labor camps. Their requests were ignored. The train journey to Siberia took 18 days. No heat, minimal food, 1 bucket for waste per car. 40 men packed into each car designed for 8 horses. Streibel died on day 12 from dysentery. His body was thrown from the moving train near Omsk. Of the 112 SS men who entered those cattle cars, 29 arrived alive at Kolyma gold mines. None survived longer than 8 months in the camps. Soviet records show that captured SS personnel faced a survival rate of less than 3%. Regular Wehrmacht prisoners had a 38% survival rate. The difference was intentional. Spring 1944 brought the liberation of the first major extermination camps. Soviet forces reached Majdanek on July 24th and found evidence of systematic mass murder that shocked even hardened combat veterans. Gas chambers with scratches on the walls. Warehouses filled with human hair, shoes, and gold teeth. Crematoria still warm with ashes. When Soviet troops captured the remaining SS guards at Majdanek, 17 men total, they didn't bother with formal processing. Major Alexei Kozlov of the 125th Rifle Regiment ordered his men to force the SS guards into the same gas chambers they had operated. The guards were locked inside and poison gas was released. All 17 died within minutes. Kozlov's report, discovered in Soviet archives in 1994, contains a single line about the incident. Fascist criminals received appropriate justice. No investigation followed. No disciplinary action was taken. The Red Army considered it poetic justice. The systematic hunting of SS personnel extended beyond active combat zones. Soviet intelligence compiled detailed lists of SS officers and their known locations. The NKVD operated what they called retribution special pursuit groups, dedicated teams tasked with tracking down and capturing specific SS war criminals. SS Brigade Führer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the Butcher of Warsaw, was captured in Austria on May 8, 1945. Soviet agents had tracked him for 6 months across 3 countries. When finally cornered in a monastery near Salzburg, Bach-Zelewski attempted to bargain for his life by offering intelligence about other war criminals. The Soviet response was swift and final. Bach-Zelewski was tortured for information, then executed by firing squad. His body was dismembered and scattered in different locations to prevent any memorial or gravesite. Soviet records indicate this treatment, dismemberment post-execution, was standard protocol for high-ranking SS officers. If you value documented World War II history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Soviet military archives and German federal archives. Now back to the story. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 provided the Red Army with its largest haul of SS prisoners. As Soviet forces fought street by street through the German capital, they captured approximately 3,000 SS personnel defending the government quarter. These weren't camp guards or rear echelon staff. These were the elite, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler members, personal bodyguards of Nazi leadership, the true believers who fought to the last. Marshal Georgy Zhukov personally ordered that no SS prisoners were to be taken alive during the final assault on the Reich Chancellery. Soviet soldiers were given explicit instructions. Any man in SS uniform was to be shot on sight. The order was carried out with methodical efficiency. Colonel Pavel Antonov documented the execution of 47 SS officers captured in the Chancellery bunker system on May 2, 1945. The executions took place in the same courtyard where Hitler had held his last public appearance. Each SS officer was forced to kneel beside a pit that had been hastily dug by Soviet engineers. A single shot to the back of the head, bodies fell into the pit and were immediately covered with lime. The most senior SS officer captured alive in Berlin was SS Gruppenführer Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the Chancellery Defense Sector. Mohnke had personally overseen the massacre of Canadian prisoners at Normandy and the execution of American POWs during the Battle of the Bulge. Soviet intelligence had a thick file on his war crimes. Mohnke's interrogation lasted 3 weeks in NKVD headquarters in Berlin. Soviet records describe sessions lasting up to 18 hours, with interrogators working in shifts to maintain constant pressure. Mohnke was forced to stand for days without sleep, given only bread and water, and subjected to what Soviet documents called physical persuasion methods. On May 26th, Mohnke signed a confession detailing his role in multiple war crimes, including the murder of 78 prisoners of war and the execution of 214 Soviet civilians. 3 days later, he was found dead in his cell. Official cause: suicide by hanging. Unofficial reports suggest he was beaten to death by guards who had lost family members in SS massacres. The scope of Soviet revenge against captured SS personnel extended far beyond immediate executions. The Soviets established special labor camps specifically for SS prisoners, facilities designed not for containment but for systematic elimination through overwork and starvation. Camp 49 in the Kolyma region was designated exclusively for SS personnel and high-ranking Nazi officials. Of the 832 SS men sent there between 1945 and 1947, only 12 survived until Stalin's death in 1953. The camp's mortality rate of 98.5% wasn't accidental. It was the intended outcome. Daily rations at Camp 49 consisted of 200 grams of black bread, thin soup made from potato peels, and occasional scraps of spoiled fish. Prisoners worked 16-hour shifts in gold mines at temperatures reaching minus 40 degrees Celsius. No winter clothing was provided. Medical care was non-existent. Former camp guard Viktor Semenov, interviewed in 1998, recalled that SS prisoners were deliberately assigned the most dangerous tasks: clearing unstable mine shafts, handling explosives without safety equipment, and working exposed positions during Arctic storms. we had our orders," Semenov said. These fascists were to work until they died. No exceptions. The few SS personnel who managed to survive Soviet captivity faced additional persecution upon their eventual return to Germany in the 1950s. Soviet intelligence had compiled detailed files on every SS prisoner, documenting their crimes, their collaborators, and their family members. This information was shared with East German authorities and used for decades of continued persecution. SS Rottenführer Hans Kellner, captured at Stalingrad and one of the few to survive Soviet labor camps, was arrested again in 1957 by East German police. Soviet files indicated Kellner had participated in anti-partisan operations in Belarus, killing an estimated 43 civilians. He was tried, convicted, and executed in Leipzig on March 14th, 1958, 13 years after his initial capture. The systematic nature of Soviet retribution against SS personnel becomes clear when examining survival statistics across different prisoner categories. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers captured by the Soviets had a 38% survival rate. Luftwaffe personnel, 41%, Navy, 44%, SS personnel, 2.7%. These numbers weren't the result of chaotic battlefield justice or random violence. They reflect a deliberate policy of elimination implemented at every level of Soviet command structure. From Stalin's directives to individual field commanders, the message was consistent. SS prisoners were not to survive the war. The hunting of SS personnel took on almost obsessive characteristics among certain Soviet units. The Third Shock Army maintained what they called death books, detailed logs of every SS officer killed or captured, complete with photographs and personal effects. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov kept meticulous records, documenting the execution of 147 SS personnel between June 1944 and May 1945. Petrov's unit specialized in what Soviet command termed cleansing operations, systematic searches of German positions for SS personnel attempting to disguise themselves as regular Wehrmacht soldiers. The SS blood group tattoo under the left armpit made identification simple. Any prisoner with a tattoo was separated and shot within hours of capture. On March 23, 1945, near Frankfurt under Oder, Petrov's men captured a German Feldwebel who claimed to be regular army. The blood group tattoo revealed him as SS Unterscharführer Georg Brenner of the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit notorious for massacring civilians in Warsaw and Belarus. Brenner was forced to dig his own grave before being executed by the same shovel he had used to bury it. The Dirlewanger Brigade represented the absolute worst of SS brutality. Composed of convicted criminals and military prisoners, the unit was responsible for killing an estimated 200,000 civilians during anti-partisan operations. When Soviet forces finally cornered the brigade's survivors near Berlin, they showed no restraint. 43 Dirlewanger personnel were captured alive on April 19, 1945. Soviet records indicate they were tortured for 3 days to extract information about mass grave locations, then executed one by one while the others watched. The final survivor, a 17-year-old recruit named Klaus Weber, was forced to watch his comrades die before being beaten to death with rifle butts. Weber's youth provided no protection. Soviet policy made no distinction based on age when it came to SS personnel. The youngest SS prisoner executed by Soviet forces was 16 years old, a Hitler Youth member who had been transferred to Waffen-SS in the final weeks of the war. His name was Friedrich Hoffmann, captured during the defense of Breslau. He was shot on May 4, 1945, 3 days before Germany's surrender. The brutality extended to SS medical personnel, supposedly protected under Geneva Convention rules. Dr. Hans Müller, chief medical officer at Auschwitz-Birkenau, was captured by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. During the camp's liberation, Müller had personally overseen medical experiments on prisoners, including hypothermia studies and sterilization procedures. Müller's execution was particularly savage. Soviet guards forced him to undergo the same hypothermia experiments he had conducted on prisoners. He was stripped naked and left in a cell flooded with ice water for 6 hours. When he finally died from exposure, guards threw his body into the same crematorium he had used to dispose of his victims. The liberation of concentration camps provided Soviet forces with the most compelling evidence of SS crimes. At Majdanek, they found detailed records of daily killings, signed orders from SS officers, and personal correspondence discussing the efficiency of murder operations. These documents were used to identify specific SS personnel for targeted elimination. SS Obersturmführer Karl Höcker, captured near Majdanek, had kept a personal photo album documenting his time at Auschwitz. The album contained images of SS personnel relaxing, singing, and enjoying meals while prisoners were being gassed nearby. Soviet interrogators used the photos to identify other SS officers, leading to the capture and execution of 12 additional war criminals. Hooker himself lasted 9 days under Soviet interrogation. Each day, he was shown photographs of children who had been murdered at Auschwitz and asked to identify which ones he had personally selected for death. On day 9, he was taken to a room where recordings of children crying had been playing continuously. He was shot while listening to the sounds of his victims. The scope of Soviet documentation reveals the systematic nature of their revenge campaign. NKVD files contain detailed records of 8,437 executed SS personnel, complete with names, dates, locations, and methods of killing. Each file includes photographs of the prisoner, lists of their crimes, and descriptions of their final moments. Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Andropov, later to become head of the KGB, personally oversaw many SS executions in occupied Austria. His reports describe forcing SS officers to write letters to their families explaining their crimes before being shot. The letters were then sent to German addresses as psychological warfare, spreading fear among civilian populations about the fate of SS personnel. One such letter from SS Hauptscharführer Werner Schmidt to his wife in Munich reads, "I have been captured by the Bolsheviks. They have shown me what we did in the camps. God forgive me. I will not see you again." Schmidt was executed 30 minutes after writing the letter. His wife received it 6 weeks later, along with a photograph of his corpse. The psychological warfare aspect of Soviet treatment extended to captured SS families. When Soviet forces discovered that SS officers, wives and children were living in nearby towns, they were often arrested and forced to witness the execution of their husbands and fathers. The trauma was intentional, designed to ensure that surviving SS families would carry the memory of Soviet justice for generations. Anna Müller, wife of SS Sturmbannführer Hans Müller, was forced to watch her husband's execution along with her 2 young children. Soviet records indicate this was standard procedure for families of high-ranking SS officers. The psychological impact was considered part of the punishment, extending Soviet justice beyond the individual criminals to their entire bloodlines. Soviet Marshal Vasily Chuikov, who commanded forces at Stalingrad and later Berlin, wrote in his memoirs, "We showed no mercy to those who showed no mercy to our people." The SS received exactly what they deserved, nothing less than complete destruction. The final phase of SS elimination came with specialized Soviet units formed specifically to track down war criminals attempting to escape through the so-called rat lines to South America. The SMERSH organization, whose name literally meant death to spies, operated teams across occupied Germany hunting fleeing SS officers. Captain Alexander Korolev led one such team that tracked SS Standartenführer Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, to a safe house in Bavaria. Barbie had tortured and executed hundreds of French resistance fighters, including personally murdering children with his bare hands. When Soviet forces surrounded his hideout on June 15, 1945, Barbie attempted to negotiate. He offered Soviet agents detailed intelligence about American intelligence operations in exchange for his life. Korolev's response was to shoot Barbie in both kneecaps, then drag him to a barn where French resistance survivors were waiting. They were given 30 minutes alone with their tormentor before Soviet soldiers finished him off. The barn contained 17 other SS corpses by morning. Korolev's report noted simply, French partisans expressed gratitude for Soviet justice. Perhaps the most brutal fate awaited SS personnel captured at the Nuremberg trial site, when Allied forces handed over custody of minor SS war criminals to Soviet authorities. The transfers became death sentences disguised as legal proceedings. Of the 237 SS personnel transferred to Soviet custody between 1945 and 1947, 0 survived to return home. The transfers took place at a railway station in Nuremberg, with American and British officials present to witness what they believed were routine prisoner exchanges. Soviet records reveal that the trains never reached their supposed destinations. Instead, they stopped at abandoned stations where NKVD teams executed all prisoners and disposed of bodies in pre-dug mass graves. Colonel James Patterson of the U.S. Army, who oversaw several transfers, later wrote in his diary, "Something felt wrong about handing those prisoners over to the Soviets. Their officers seemed too eager, too pleased. We never heard from any of those men again." Patterson didn't learn the truth until Soviet archives were opened in 1991. The scale of execution becomes staggering when examining regional Soviet records. In occupied Poland alone, Soviet forces executed 4,216 SS personnel between January and December 1945. In Czechoslovakia, 2,897. In Hungary, 3,412. The numbers represent the systematic elimination of an entire organization. Each execution was documented with bureaucratic precision. NKVD files contain death certificates, photographs of corpses, and detailed inventories of personal effects seized from executed prisoners. Gold teeth were extracted and melted down. Watches and jewelry were cataloged and sent to Moscow. Even SS uniform buttons were collected and recycled. The personal effects revealed the human side of absolute evil. SS Oberfuhrer Rudolf Lange, executed for his role in the Rumbla massacre, where 30,000 Jews were murdered, carried photographs of his children and a love letter from his wife. His wallet contained a shopping list written in his daughter's handwriting. Bread, milk, butter for Papa. Lang was shot while reading the list. Some SS personnel attempted desperate measures to avoid capture. Near Rostock, Soviet forces discovered a mass suicide site where 43 SS officers had killed themselves rather than face Soviet justice. They had used a single grenade, with survivors finishing each other off with daggers. A hastily scrawled note found at the scene read, "Better death than Bolshevik torture." The suicides provided no escape from Soviet revenge. Orders specified that SS corpses were to be mutilated and left unburied as warnings to local German populations. The Rostock bodies were displayed in the town square for 6 days before being thrown into unmarked graves. Photographs of the decomposing corpses were distributed to nearby towns as psychological warfare. Soviet intelligence also targeted SS personnel who had managed to integrate into civilian populations. Extensive networks of informants, including German communists and concentration camp survivors, provided tips about SS members living under false identities. These tip-offs led to some of the most brutal individual executions of the war. Hans Bibo, former administrator of the Lodz ghetto, was discovered working as a farmhand near Hamburg in October 1945. He had assumed the identity of a dead Wehrmacht soldier and lived quietly for 6 months before a survivor recognized him at a local market. Soviet agents arrested him the same night. Bibo's execution was turned into public spectacle. He was transported to the site of the former Lodz ghetto and hanged from the same gallows he had used to execute Jewish prisoners. Ghetto survivors were invited to witness the hanging. Many threw stones at his corpse. His body was left hanging for 2 weeks before being cut down and burned. The final reckoning came with the discovery of mass graves across Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces liberated concentration camps and occupied territories, they uncovered evidence of systematic genocide perpetrated by SS units. The scale of the atrocities hardened Soviet attitudes and provided additional justification for the brutal treatment of SS prisoners. At Treblinka, Soviet investigators found remains of approximately 870,000 victims in mass graves. At Sobibor, 250,000 bodies. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 1 million murdered. Every site provided detailed records of SS personnel responsible for the killing operations. Soviet Colonel David Dragunsky, who investigated war crimes at multiple sites, wrote in his 1946 report, "The evidence of SS crimes is overwhelming. These are not soldiers who deserve protection under international law. They are mass murderers who forfeited any claim to human treatment." The Red Army's treatment of captured SS personnel represented a systematic campaign of revenge that matched the industrial scale of Nazi genocide. It was calculated, methodical, and ultimately successful in its goal of eliminating the SS as an organization. Of an estimated 50,000 SS personnel captured by Soviet forces, fewer than 1,500 survived to see Germany again. In 1991, construction workers renovating a building in the former East Berlin discovered a sealed basement room containing the remains of over 200 individuals. Forensic analysis revealed that all were male, aged between 20 and 45 tours, and showed signs of execution-style killings. Uniform buttons and insignia fragments identified them as SS personnel. Carbon dating placed their deaths between 1945 and 1947. Each skull showed a single bullet hole behind the left ear, the standard Soviet execution method. No records exist of their names, ranks, or specific crimes. They were simply filed away as fascist criminals and forgotten for 46 years. The basement room contained one additional item, a handwritten note in Russian dated May 15, 1945. The message was brief: for Leningrad, for Stalingrad, for every burned village. It was signed by Captain Boris Volkov of the NKVD, the same officer who had interrogated and executed dozens of SS prisoners throughout the war. The SS believed they were the master race, destined to rule Europe for 1,000 years. They lasted 12. When the reckoning came, it came with Soviet efficiency and Soviet justice. No mercy, no appeals, no second chances. The wolves had become prey and the hunt was merciless.